Hi guys, so we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about how different taxa acquire and process nutrients. So just as a recap where we've been, we've talked about the nutrients that all organisms need, specifically macromolecules, that are a type of polymers that are composed of monomers. And then we've talked about different types of macronutrients, micronutrients, or the essential vitamins and minerals that organisms need, and this idea of conservation of matter, and the fact that organisms can't create elements out of nothing, and that's why they need to consume nutrients in order to survive, to make up these different macromolecules. So this stuff is covered in a previous lecture. If you've not yet viewed that previous lecture, please check that out before you move on to this lecture, which is going to cover some of the generalities of nutrient acquisition, specifically the different types of trophy. And this should be a review for most folks. So in terms of the generalities for nutrient acquisition, all organisms have to do two things. Number one, they need an energy source and a carbon source. And number two, they require gas exchange with the environment or air or water in order to acquire nutrients. Okay, so let's discuss what I mean by an energy source and a carbon source for nutrient acquisition. So all organisms need an energy source, and they can either get that energy from light or they can get that energy from chemical compounds. And remember, they need this energy source basically to use as an energy source to put into chemical bonds, to form chemical bonds, and also they can turn that chemical energy subsequently back into different forms of energy, potentially in the form of a molecule like ATP, which is a sort of chemical currency that's used in cell as a way to sort of power all the different types of chemical reactions that organisms have to survive or do to survive on a sort of daily basis at the cellular level. Okay, and so all of that energy, that sort of chemical energy that organisms store, ultimately has to come from somewhere, and that's either from sunlight or that's from chemical compounds. And organisms that get that energy source from sunlight are called phototrophs. Organisms that get that that energy from chemical compounds in the environment are called chemotrophs. And then the other essential thing that organisms need is a carbon source. Okay, so they need a carbon source, and they can get that carbon that makes up sort of carbon molecules that make up these organisms from two major different sources. So they can either get it from inorganic sources, so for example, carbon dioxide in the air, and if they can get that carbon out of carbon dioxide or from some other inorganic source, some other non-living source, they're called an autotroph. Or if they get those carbons from organic compounds, in other words, from other living organisms or eating other living organisms, so for example, a rabbit might eat a plant and get the carbon from that plant and the organic molecules that make up that plant. That's an example of a heterotroph, so that's eating others. Auto is basically self, in this case, inorganic sources. Hetero means other. And so you can break these different organisms down into either photoautotrophs or photoheterotrophs, or chemoautotrophs or chemoheterotrophs, depending on what their energy source and their carbon source is. Okay? So why is it that organisms need a carbon source to make carbon-to-carbon bonds? Go ahead and answer that question or type that in. Why do organisms need a carbon source for carbon-to-carbon bonds? And think back to the essential sort of nutrients that organisms need. All right, so if you see they need a carbon source to make carbon-carbon bonds, to make important carbon-based organic molecules, so things like amino acids, things like sugars, things like nucleotides, so these monomers that make up the polymers that are the essential macromolecules that organisms need. So remember, amino acids make proteins, sugars make polysaccharides, nucleotides make nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And there's also many other important carbon-based organic molecules that organisms need carbon for to make these sort of carbon-to-carbon bonds that you see in each of these molecules. And that's when we talk about the fact that humans and other animals were carbon-based organisms. It means that carbon makes up these important molecules that make us up, these essential molecules for life. These are carbon-based molecules. Okay, so given what we know about phototrophs and chemotrophs, these different ways that organisms acquire energy, and autotrophs versus heterotrophs, these different ways that organisms get the carbon that they use for carbon-to-carbon bonds, which box do plants go in? A, B, C, or D? And which plants do animals and fungi go in? A, B, C, or D? Okay, so if you said plants go into box A, plants are photoautotrophs. they get their energy from sunlight, they get their carbon-to-carbon bonds from carbon dioxide, so they are photoautotrophs. And then animals and fungi are examples of chemoheterotrophs. So they get their energy from eating chemicals that are in other organisms or consuming chemicals from other organisms, and they get their carbon-to-carbon bonds from eating other organisms. Okay, so animals and fungi are chemoheterotrophs. And these are the two major groups that we're going to concentrate on in this unit. So we're going to be talking about plants as our representative of photoautotrophs. We're going to be talking about animals and fungi as our representatives of chemoheterotrophs. And sometimes you may hear me refer to the photoautotrophs or plants just as photosynthesizers, just as a sort of simplified way of talking about them. And the chemoheterotrophs, I may often refer to them just as heterotrophs, just as a sort of simplified way to talk about them. Just know when I talk about photosynthesizers and heterotrophs, I'm talking about photoautotrophs and chemoheterotrophs. Okay, so we talked about this idea that in terms of nutrient acquisition, all organisms need an energy source and a carbon source. Now let's talk about this other sort of major requirement that all organisms require: gas exchange with the environment. When I talk about the environment, I'm talking about gas exchange from air or water. So this is the type of habitat that an organism's in. So terrestrial organisms will do gas exchange with the air, and aquatic organisms will do gas exchange with water. Okay, so remember that gases float around in the air. Remember that gases are also dissolved in water. So there's oxygen, carbon dioxide, all of those sorts of gases that we think of in the air are also dissolved in water. Okay, so why do organisms need to exchange gases? So think of gases like CO2 and O2. In other words, what cellular processes are these needed for organisms to survive? Go ahead and write that in the box. All right, so if you said something like cellular respiration or photosynthesis, that is correct. So remember, all eukaryotic organisms do cellular respiration, and many prokaryotic organisms can also do cellular respiration. And oxygen is a gas that's a major reactant in cellular respiration, and CO2 is a gas that's a major product of cellular respiration. And so organisms need to be able to exchange gases or get O2 into all of their cells to do cellular respiration. And they also need to be able to dump this CO2 waste out of their cells to do cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is a fundamental process that many organisms have to do. They need oxygen from the environment to do that, and they need to dump out the CO2 waste to do that. And so any lack or buildup of these gases can be fatal for organisms. And so these organisms that do cellular respiration, which is a lot of organisms, for example, all eukaryotic organisms, to be able to do that, they need to be able to exchange these gases with the environment. Same goes for photosynthesis. So any photosynthetic organism requires CO2 as a major component of this reaction and has to get rid of O2 as a sort of byproduct or a waste product of this reaction. And so they need to be able to exchange gases with their environment to get CO2 from the environment in order to sort of run this reaction and power this reaction. Okay, so these are just two examples of the types of gases and the types of reactions that many organisms have to do. There are organisms that don't do cellular respiration or don't do photosynthesis. Some prokaryotic organisms, for example, that don't do these processes, but they will still have gases that they need to acquire from the environment to do whatever sort of metabolic reaction it is that they do. And in any case, lack of or buildup of the sort of gases that are either required for this reaction or build up as a byproduct of these reactions can be fatal for these organisms. So they need to be able to exchange them with the environment. Okay, so please answer these questions. So why do organisms need nutrients? All of the above. They're necessary for the building blocks of molecules that are essential for life. They are the reactants important in biological reactions and processes, and organisms can't synthesize them on their own. So when we say them, what we're talking about are the elements that make up these important sort of molecules. So organisms can synthesize nucleic acids, they can synthesize nucleotides, but they can't create the individual elements that make those biological molecules up. They've got to get those elements that make up, or the nutrients that make up the molecules, the elements that make up those essential nutrients from the environment. All organisms do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. This is a false statement, okay? So many organisms do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. In fact, all eukaryotes do cellular respiration, and some eukaryotes, but only some eukaryotes, do photosynthesis, but not all organisms do both or either. So we talked about a lot of examples way back in previous lectures about prokaryotic metabolisms that don't do cellular respiration or photosynthesis, things that do like fermentation, for example. But just know that all organisms don't do photosynthesis and cellular respiration. These are sort of unique things that only some organisms can do. All organisms require the same nutrients. That is a false statement, okay? So there are some nutrients that all living organisms do require, okay? So we talked about those sort of essential macromolecules of life. So things like nucleic acids, things like proteins, things like polysaccharides. These are nutrients that all organisms require, and those nutrients are composed of important macro molecules. So things like carbon, things like nitrogen, things like phosphorus. Okay, so these are important macronutrients because they're needed in relatively large amounts for each organism. However, there are many nutrients, things like the essential vitamins and minerals, that vary across organisms. So required by some organisms, but not other organisms. So all organisms do not require the same nutrients, although there are some that all do require. Okay, so as a recap, in the lecture before this one, we covered all of these things. In this lecture, we talked about the generalities of nutrient acquisition and the different types of trophy. So we talked about the fact that all organisms need an energy source and a carbon source. And these sources, where these sources come from, determine whether an organism is phototrophic, autotrophic, chemotrophic, or heterotrophic. And then we talked about the fact that all organisms require gas exchange in order to get the carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and potentially other elements that are required for their major metabolic reactions. Okay, so in the next lecture, what we're going to talk about are adaptations for acquiring and transporting nutrients.